Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Vol Performance online workshop series. Really fortunate today to have a great panel of guests talking about managing the MMA athlete. For those of you who haven't been involved in any of the Vol Performance online workshop series, today we have a live webinar where we're going to be fortunate enough to ask some questions of the panelists and discuss the interdisciplinary approach to managing an MMA athlete. What we've been trying to create at the Vol Performance online workshop series is a facilitation of creative discussions, enabling practitioners to share ideas, concepts and experiences around high performance sport and sports medicine. And today we're getting to reach out to some of the best in the industry in UFC PI at Shanghai. So really looking forward to the discussion today. We had Joseph Coyne give us a presentation as a pre-record, which will be available as well for you to view at the link as seen here on the screen. So if you want to get another understanding of how the interdisciplinary approach applies to the MMA athlete and how they're applying this at Shanghai, there's a great presentation online that Joseph has done as part of the workshop series. Today, I want to introduce you to the panelists that we have with us, and I'm going to get each of the panelists to introduce themselves before we kickstart the Q&A. So, Joseph, I might start with you if you want to unmute yourself and just introduce yourself, give us a bit of an insight into how you got to where you are and how you've enjoyed the journey so far.
All right. Well, thanks, Sal. Thanks for hosting us on Vol Performance. I've seen some of the other ones you put on, and they've been red hot. So it's an honour to be on here and to be able to share our sort of approach and what we're doing out in Shanghai. So my name's Joseph Coyne. I'm the performance director out in Shanghai, and I help lead up this team of all the disciplines that we have out there. In terms of how I got involved in the UFC, I actually. Particularly, I did part of my PhD research on some UFC athletes, and then I've also known the VP of Performance, Duncan French, for a long time. And I'd also worked out in China for around 3 years in 2 different roles, one with Exos and the Chinese Olympic Committee, and then one directly with Chinese track and field. So that's sort of the background to how I sort of got involved with the UFC PI out in Shanghai.
Fantastic. And Dean, as Director of MMA, can you give us insight into your journey to Shanghai?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Al, for having us all on today. Yeah, so I've been a lifelong martial artist. Started martial arts at 4 years old, and then was lucky enough to have a career in mixed martial arts as well, and fought professionally for a number of years. But even while I was fighting professionally, I was part of the team Roughhouse out of the UK, which is like Paul Daly, Dan Hardy, Ross Pearson, a number of UFC fighters. But so even while I was fighting, I was also coaching, and it's something that has always interested me and something I had an aptitude for. And then once my career ended, and almost simultaneously as well, I was also working within strength and conditioning. So I worked in rugby as well, and worked as a contact skills coach as well as with strength and conditioning, and kind of both those things together had given me a little bit of a different perspective to the approach for mixed martial arts, and having this interdisciplinary team that we have now was kind of like a dream previously, when I was as a fighter, and even when I was as a coach, I was kind of trying to do. I was sports science, I was S&C, I was everything. I was a one-man band even when I was working with some of the highest level guys in the sport, and then this opportunity for this job came up through knowing Forrest Griffin as well, and going through the interview process, and yeah, like I said, dream come true with the team that we have put together, and in terms of performance team for MMA.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm looking forward to some of your insights and how the collaboration with, I guess, the performance department assists in building the MMA athlete. Gavin Pratt, as the strength and conditioning coach or physical performance coach, can you give us an insight into your pathway to the UFC PI at Shanghai?
Yeah, thank you, Sal. Yes, I'm the manager of strength and conditioning out at the UFC PI in Shanghai. And before that, I've been in China for about 4 years. We were trying to set up the Olympic surf program out of a province called Zhejiang and a city called Hangzhou. And then previous to that, I was working with Exos as well, this time in Shanghai with the Shanghai Research Institute of Sports Science. So working with Olympic-based sports towards the China National Games, which is one of the biggest competitions in the world outside the Olympics. So that's been my background within China. And I think that experience probably had a lot to do with the ability to work in China with the UFC PI.
Excellent. Felix, as sports science manager or director, can you give us an insight into your integration into the UFC PI?
Yeah, thanks for having us on. I've been in China for the last 6 years. So prior to the UFC, I was with the Shanghai Sharks basketball team, kind of in a sports scientist, strength and conditioning role. It kind of blended all together. And then before the Shanghai Sharks, I was at Loughborough Sports as a sports scientist, working with mainly Olympic-based sports.
Excellent. And Paul, as a physical therapist, you dealing with MMA athletes and a unique brand of athlete. How did you find your way to UFC PI?
Yeah, thanks, Sal. So I'm originally from the UK, and I've kind of worked in rugby, worked through the academy system all the way up into Premiership, first teams. And from there, I then transferred to the National Sports Institute in Malaysia, where I kind of cut my teeth across a number of different sports, including other combat sports as well. And having spent about 2.5 years, 3 years there, I then found my pathway into UFC. So from many injuries back in rugby to pretty much the same thing here in MMA.
Fantastic. And Reid, I've saved you for last because I think weight management and weight classification is a unique component of MMA, and as the performance nutritionist, you have a big say in that. How did you end up working with MMA athletes?
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Sal. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this. So prior to working with the UFC, I was located in the US at the IMG Academy in Bradenton, in Florida, where I worked with Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So I was there for 2 years, working with mainly US pro sports, so like basketball, football, baseball, these sort of sports. And while I was in the US, that's where I met Clint Wattenberg, who's the director of nutrition at the UFC PI in Vegas. But I guess what really set me up for the job was prior to my time in the US, I was based at the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, where I worked as a sports dietitian with Olympic combat sports in the lead up to the Rio Olympic Games. And I also completed a PhD looking at weight cutting in Olympic combat sports. So that's kind of what set me up for the role with the UFC.
Fantastic. So the way that today is going to work for people who have logged in and watching us live, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A box and I can facilitate that to the panelists. Joe, for those people who are unaware of the UFC PI Shanghai program and your philosophy, can you give us a quick insight into what the philosophy is of Shanghai and how it may differ from the Vegas facility?
Yeah, sure. So, look, we've although we might have some subtle differences with what we have in Shanghai versus the Las Vegas facility in terms of our athlete population are in-house, they're full-time, versus the Vegas facility, they might come and go with some people being there full-time, but a lot coming and going. The vast majority of our philosophy, our vision, our mission, it remains consistent across both sites. So we want to be the global blueprint basically for MMA talent development. That's our big ticket vision that we have for the PI and across both sites. And then as part of this, we kind of want to set the standard around the world for how we develop talent in MMA, how we prepare the talent, and then their performance, and not just their performance, but their health and well-being for all the combat sports. And to do this, we've got to have fully integrated between our technical, which is our MMA, led up by Dean, and non-technical service structure. That's got to be just one thing operating together, and it's got to revolve around the athlete. And so we talk about this interdisciplinary model where everything revolves around the athlete, and then also this model's flat in terms of all the respective technical disciplines there's no priority given to one or the other in terms of sharing information or deciding what to do, although there will be cases where maybe there'll be situational leads. I mentioned in that presentation about potentially a long-term rehabilitation. There might be a situational lead there, but we've got this flat model, flat performance team model, and then part of my role, I guess, is just coordinating all the different technical disciplines, the MMA, the strength conditioning, the nutrition, into one cohesive unit that hopefully produces the best results in the world for athletes out there.
Yeah, the Las Vegas Institute has obviously been really transparent with sharing their information around quantifying performance and characteristics with their athletes. Have you used the same tests within strength and conditioning, and Gav, how you've assessed those athletes to then determine the physical characteristics?
Yeah, we want to see an across the board results, I guess, because then we can focus our KPIs on it. We need to determine what it takes to win, and not only what it takes to win within MMA and the UFC, but we have to be quite specific with regards to weight categories as well. Every weight category, every weight class has shown to have a slightly different way that it actually has a dominant way to win. So we need to be aware of those statistics, and then we need to train for that as well. So I think that's why it's really important that across the board, we do similar tests. And then in Shanghai, we can not only compare that with the roster that is currently in the UFC, because remember, we've got the academy guys predominantly. So we want to get them into the UFC. So we need to know what it takes to get into the UFC, to be successful in the UFC. And then we need to come up with our own statistics as well for what we expect within the Shanghai Performance Institute as well. And that way we can probably talk about it a little bit more, but we do have tiered athletes or levels of athletes and fighters within the facility. And so if there's an athlete that's a level A and we've got an athlete that's a level C, we might actually have some statistics as to what it will take for them to get up to that top hierarchy in terms of skills and performance output.
Have you seen a big difference between the type of athlete that has come into the Shanghai facility versus the Vegas facility based on what they've been exposed to within China and within, I guess, the development of MMA in China?
Well, I'll only be able to speak from, I guess, the strength and power and the conditioning side of it. The other side's definitely up to Dean, but from the strength and conditioning, I guess we've just got a younger academy than maybe compared to some of the guys coming into the Vegas, guys and girls coming into the Vegas facility. Also, I think a lot of the methods are quite different across the board throughout China versus, say, America and Australia in terms of their strength and conditioning. Not wrong, not right in either country. It's just different. So we have seen some differences in terms of the testing results, but not as different as I would have thought. Our guys and girls at the facility have come up some really great isometric mid-thigh pull results compared to some of the results in Vegas. But then that sort of chops and changes depending on the test as well. So it's now about us looking into those results, making the applicable changes and seeing where it heads us.
Dean, as the director of MMA and I guess assessing that more technical and tactical component, how have you found that has possibly differed from what you've seen in some of the American athletes compared to the Shanghai Institute?
Yeah, so one of the main things is that the sport is possibly a little bit younger in China in terms of established coaches and established MMA gyms and whatnot. So that's also reflected in their technical ability. So although we have some, we have some high level wrestlers that are part of the national team and high level Sanda fighters. So in terms of their technical ability in particular areas, they're high performers. But in terms of those transitions between striking into takedowns and the nuance of what mixed martial arts is as a sport in itself now, which is what really MMA is about. That's what differentiates it, is the integration of the different technical martial arts. And so those bits, they were probably lacking, and that's kind of what we focused on primarily from a technical standpoint as a whole. Obviously, it's individual dependent depending on what their style is and so forth. But as an overarching assessment of where they place technically, that's probably the area that they're lacking. But we do have some exceptional athletes like sort of Gavin alluded to. And just to give some further background, to build on what Joseph said as well, is that obviously there's a huge alignment philosophically between us and Vegas in terms of our approach. But the number one difference is that we developed obviously together as well with Vegas, the MMA Combine, which is very similar to the NFL Combine, which we use as a recruitment tool for selecting the initial first 26 athletes. And these fighters came from around China, and we first selected them based on their record and their fight record, and we watched some tape on them. Then they were invited. I think initially we had 40 athletes come to that combine, and then some of those performance markers that you were previously talking about that we've shared publicly, then we use that to combine with some technical assessments as well to give us a score on where these athletes were. And we use that as part of the recruitment tool, as well as videotape and a couple of other things. And then we selected those guys. And then once they had that scholarship, they're part of the program, and they're there full time and part of our the academy. And then that academy, we're also helping prepare for fights, helping them choose fights, and then shaping their career to get them to the point that they're at the level to fight in the UFC. And up until that point, we've had a really successful win record and so forth. And we were going to be having the Dana White's Contender Series Asia, which was going to be effectively China versus the rest of Asia, like China versus Japan and Korea. And that was going to be, a really good platform and sort of pathway for our athletes to get to the UFC and get those contracts. But obviously with the global pandemic and everything shutting down, unfortunately, that will probably be postponed until next year. But in terms of a pathway of our main focus of developing the athletes, that's kind of what we're, how we're approaching it.
And with that combine that you've spoken about, how do you as an interdisciplinary team sit down and determine which qualities are actually best define a successful UFC athlete, given what you said, that some of the differences with the type of athletes you're seeing? So you have the strength and power characteristics you're assessing, but then obviously you have the technical, tactical. Are you putting more weight on a certain component of that, or is it very much individualized? And how exactly do you sit down as a team and discuss who earns the right to be in the academy, as you mentioned?
So, I mean, Joseph's probably be best to answer in terms of the actual tests and the weighting of them, because Duncan and himself, there was an algorithm kind of put together in terms of weighting of those particular tests. So, like isometric with throw pull might not have this, or might have more weight than grip strength, for example, or the glycolytic test, whatever it might be. And different tests had different weighting, and I think the technical test obviously had a significant weighting one. It wasn't all one for the particular test, but the decision making that went into the type of tests that were first used were based off the data that we've been collecting from the PI in Las Vegas, and what the one performance marker that has seemed to have most significance in terms of within the rankings and a correlation was the landmine punch throw, but there are other ones that obviously are general performance markers that across any like physical characteristics that you would want. But the technical component of it is always difficult to pin down in just in a day scenario or day test. To get a real picture of the technical proficiency or capacity of an athlete that is challenging. So there's limitations there. So that's why the fight footage plays into it as well. But when it was coming down to we've got say 24 athletes in that first group. When we're coming down, maybe they say 18 that are dead certs, and then the ones that are left, we then are playing into their physical characteristics and where they are in their weight category, getting information from Reed about where are they a good weight category fit, or any injury markers that might have come from Paul. So we're trying to get in that sense an interdisciplinary approach about who without knowing them too well, making a selection about who might be the better athlete or who might be the better fighter moving forward.
Felix, are you able to give any more insight into the weighting around possibly some of those tests and as Dean mentioned, correlation to possibly performance?
So the weighting of all the tests was more developed by Duncan French and Joseph Coyne. So if Coyne, you can maybe allude to that a bit further.
Sure. So like Dean said, there's more weight given to the technical tests in the combine. There's 4 technical tests. There's a wrestling test, a grappling offense, grappling defense, and a striking test. And these are assessed by the technical coaches. And then the scores that they get from that will influence the overall combine scores and whether we pick an athlete to offer them a place in our academy or not to. And then, like Dean said, there's a lot of the technical coaches will have a massive amount of input. That they'll have the main input and say, we want this guy, we've seen him fight. And it also, it comes down to what is their potential like? Where are they going to fit? How close are they going to be to the UFC in terms of, is it going to take them a long time to get there, or are they just around the corner? Sorry, I've just had my daughter pop in here. Give me a moment, Haas. I'll let Dean take over. Give me a second here.
You're right. No stress at all. Dean, with some of those assessments, does it change depending on weight class? And Reed, you may be able to give insight as well when you're talking about certain athletes in different weight classifications. How much, Reed, does your input in regards to how you feel they are anthropometry related to weight classification, and if maybe they need to change a weight class based on some of their results?
I guess I can jump in and throw a sentence or two in here, and then Dean can pick up afterwards. But yeah, certainly, like when we're deciding about the tiering of athletes, who's a category A and B and C, and this sort of thing, and who maybe gets into the program or who stays in the program. Certainly information around weight division fit is very important. If you've got an athlete who's already, moderately successful or fairly successful at a given weight class, and then we do a body composition scan, like a DEXA scan, for example, and then we find out that, the amount of fat-free mass they have is more in line with a weight division below. When I tell Dean that information, his eyes really light up, because he's like, man, this guy's already doing quite well at this weight division, and you're telling me he can drop a weight division. So that's certainly very useful information in terms of, future competitive success potential. Dean, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, that was decisive in one or two of the choices, because that selection process is difficult, because, like I said, it's a snapshot on these guys, and we're trying to pick the best talent from within China. So that is a big factor. If someone is having a relative amount of success on the domestic scene or maybe even international scene as well, and they could be in the weight category before, that would normally below, that would normally suggest that they would experience greater success in that weight category below, and the anthropometrics play into that in terms of their height and reach and so forth, and their fighting style plays into it as well. So it's not just about whether they're a good weight category fit, because sometimes particular styles suit a less of a weight cut in a very very general sense. Like strikers can afford sometimes to be in a light for the weight, as it were, because they're not using their weight in the same way, and the speed advantage can actually play into it. This is a very general, simplistic way of looking at it. And then wrestlers who are generally, once they do get hold of someone that wanting to use that weight advantage, so generally you can think of it in that way. But obviously there are exceptions to that, and that could overcomplicate it. But just to give an example, that would influence our decision making also.
And with the differing weight classes, are you seeing particular metrics that maybe correlate to better for certain weight classes? So let's use the isometric mid-thigh pull that you mentioned, Gav. If you're a heavyweight athlete, are you basically wanting athletes to have greater relative strength in relation to possibly the type of fighter they are or the weight classification within any of the metrics that you're doing in the combined test? And Joe, Gav, or Dean, you might be able to talk to either of that.
I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, and then I'll shoot to Dean. I guess one of the things is that what we find is what their background has been. So a lot of the wrestlers that are based in that grappling scenarios for most of their career tend to have a fairly good isometric mid-thigh pull for obvious reasons. But as to whether some of that translates to a particular weight category, that's probably where Dean and Joseph could answer that further.
Courtney, did you have anything to add there, mate?
Well, I would say something and just put a little disclaimer on this. The majority of our athletes that we have are all in the lighter weight classes coming in from China. And it was another factor in who got chosen too, because if we had one athlete that was in, say, heavyweight and we didn't have people to train with, that would influence, like to a small degree, whether they got offered a spot in the academy. And then just overall, I'd say it's more, as Gavin sort of alluded to, style specific in terms of the metrics that are associated with how well they do. So for instance, the strikers seem to do better with the punch throw, landmine punch throw, and able to produce more power in that, and versus the wrestlers might be across the board just a shade better in the mid-thigh pull. And strikers also maybe a bit better in the counter movement jump as well. Would be another sort of differentiator that would probably be able to tease out when we really get in and look at the different styles. Wrestlers maybe better, say, inverted rows, like in our rowing test, maybe better hand grip, things like that. But there's like inconsistencies, but those would be the general themes across the weight classes and style dependent.
Yeah, great. Paul, how much does previous injury and an athlete's injury history play into some of this combined testing and screening of athletes as to you may be great at the test, but if you've had a really poor injury history, does that impact on their selection criteria?
I mean, definitely it's something that we look at when they come into us as part of the combine. We run through some physical assessments and kind of determine sort of what range of motions they have, what simple strengths they have. And then kind of we'll discuss that with the rest of the performance team and Dean as well. Kind of just giving an indication of, you know, if they do have any reasons for any deficits that we might find on the testing. And then it's really a discussion case on kind of how much that injury, whether it's active, is going to influence their time training with us. But Dean, potentially you might have something to add to that as well.
I mean, no, not really. That I think that was covered really. I think nothing specific to add to that.
Dean, we had a question just relating to the fact that Shanghai is a little bit more of an academy. Does that mean that you're not having external influences from coaches and you, as you mentioned before, about educating them on possibly what fights to take? Are you able to educate an athlete and say, listen, I think you need to actually have a larger duration of training and not necessarily more volumes of fight? Is that a component that differs Shanghai to Vegas as well?
Oh yeah, so that once they're part of the academy, although it's incredibly important that we keep a relationship with their existing coaches from the teams that they have, and we do have good relationships from the teams, because there's as you would imagine, there's major teams within China, and so primarily we have several fighters from each of those major gyms. So we maintain that relationship with those fighters, and bear in mind that once these guys come out of the academy and we effectively do our job and they sign to the UFC, they'll no longer be part of the academy. And although they'll be able to use the services just like any of the services that Vegas and Shanghai are offered, they won't be having the technical coaching in the same way that the academy guys do, look, from myself and the rest of the technical team, because there's potentially, like, you know, a conflict of interest there for us to be giving individual technical coaching to one UFC athlete and maybe game planning and whatnot. That there's you know, implications there. So we're only giving that technical training to the academy athletes, and so those academy athletes, we have complete control of their training program when they're in there. So we're deciding what areas they need to be working on. Hopefully, when they're fighting, we're guiding that part of their career with communication, obviously, with their head coach, but effectively while they're part of the academy, I'm their head coach, and they're coming through our program.
And what does a traditional week look like for these athletes in the academy? Does it change week to week, or does it change depending if they're coming into a fight camp? And each of the different departments might be able to shed light on those variations.
Yeah, I mean, Coyne probably would have gone over that in the presentation, but I mean, am I able to share my screen to show something? It'll make it probably easier.
Yeah, yep. We can give you that I'll stop sharing mine, and then you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, hold on. Give me a moment. Excuse me. Okay, so Coyne would have gone over this in probably a little bit more detail in the presentation, but we effectively separate our training into two phases, and then they're sort of into two sub phases within those two phases. So there's off camp, which is general preparation and specific preparation, and then fight camp is split up into early fight camp and late fight camp. And from a technical standpoint, I'll cover that, and then Gav or Coyne can talk about how we have that concurrent periodization of the non-technical training as well. But in terms of a technical standpoint, in that off-camp general preparation, there's more of a technical focus and the individual martial arts. So we might focus on, as an example, you know, like the details of a single leg, but there's no necessary context around the tactical implications of how you would apply that single leg, just the nuts and bolts of it. And prior to that, we have a technical assessment of all the athletes in the varying aspects of mixed martial arts. And as we progress through to the specific preparation, then it's becoming more of a tactical emphasis, more integration of the different martial arts, but there's still separation in sparring between, you know, boxing and kickboxing. And then sorry, that was my dog. And then as you go into the fight camp, then it's all specific to MMA. So they only do MMA sparring, they only do integrated martial arts, and no separation of even if they might have a grappling session, there'll always be gloves on, there'll be strikes incorporated into it, so they'll never be isolated in that sense. And then in terms of the tactical and non-technical integration, we align those loading weeks. So each of these colors correspond to a week, each square, and then the color also corresponds to the intensity of that week. Orange being moderate, red being high, and green being low. And then as you move across the phases, as you can see, the arrows, that if a fight wasn't picked, then you move back into general preparation, and if it was, then you move into fight camp. And if Gav or Coyne, you wanted to talk about how the loading lines up in terms of peaking, in fight camp and the corresponding loading, then I'll leave that to you guys.
Yeah, Evan, go for it, mate.
Okay, so I guess the main thing with that is that as a strength and conditioning or a non-technical training perspective, we still need to be underpinning those physiological responses that we want to get in the sport of MMA. So we are almost the background in a sense. In off camp, so we have the return to training phase, gen prep and specific prep phases. That's our off camp. we'll tend to run 3 to 4 week cycles in line with the MMA cycles. So the amount of sessions that we would have in the off camp is 3 out of the 13 across the space of a week. So we've got about 13 sessions of something throughout the week. 3 of those will be dedicated to strength and conditioning. And then once the athlete moves into fight camp, that decreases from 3 to 2. So the priority definitely switches even more so into the technical training aspect. In terms of the loading parameters, we would normally start with, say, let's say it's a 3-week cycle, we would start moderate, go high, and then do a deload in that 3rd week. And I've heard Joseph say it before, we tend to do a 3-week now, because if we don't know when the athlete's fighting, it just means that we get more deloads. We don't tire the athlete out until we actually need to really prepare them for the fight. So we get more deloads per 52 weeks if we do a 3-week cycle. And then we'll try and line that up with the loading that the MMA team has got planned as well. Once it moves into the fight camp, it's fairly similar. We have early fight camp, which is a 3-week phase, and then late fight camp, which is also a 3-week phase. One of the benefits of us running our own academy is that we're pretty much in control of how long our fight camps go for. The majority of the time, obviously there's changes, but we like to do a 6-week fight camp. So specific prep, we're trying to get them ready for that fight camp. We're not trying to get them physically prepared too much within fight camp. We want that to be done already, and then they can focus on the technical aspects. So you can see that when you go into the fight camp, we're pretty much aligned until the late fight camp phase, those last 3 weeks, and then it goes the majority towards the technical training aspect. And that's where Joseph and Felix have done a fantastic job putting together an RPE-based system so that we can really see if our loading parameters are accurate and if our fatigue rates are too much or not enough or right on the money. So that's maybe where Joseph can and Felix could talk about a little bit more with regards to how we monitor that.
Yeah, that probably leads me into my next question around the modification of volume and intensity and what metrics you're using to determine that. So Felix, if you've got some insight into possibly some of the monitoring strategies that you're using and how that's influencing the changes between off camp and fight camp.
Yeah, so as Gavin already said, we're definitely using SRPEs. So every athlete rates every session, but also the coaches give us their planned session load. So we always have that comparison between coaches' plan versus athlete response. The system that we're using, we have a centralized area in our facility, which is the fuel bar. So after every training session or going to the cafeteria, everybody sort of always passes that location. So there's a laptop set up there where athletes can freely enter their RPEs for all the sessions. We take care of the durations, and then from that Excel sheet, that data populates sort of a Power BI visualization dashboard, where then the coaches can kind of discuss different athletes. We can look at what camp status they're in, pick a different selection of dates, look at their week-to-week changes, the distribution between non-technical training and technical training, and just sort of the trend of the actual training load. Is it mirroring what we're looking at, what we actually want out of the athlete, or is there some sort of difference? Is there a need for sort of further investigation? And then we couple that with omega wave testing. Not all of our athletes are on it. Not all of our athletes are on it all the time. We usually give the omega wave to the athletes in fight camp. So it's just another added monitoring tool. We have some sort of familiarization period, but the main focus is during fight camp. And, we look at DC potential, the autonomic balance, and it's just another tool that we can use in the morning meetings before training. If anybody has some sort of differences in what we'd expect out of the training load or from the omega wave, then there's a source of discussion between all sort of departments. And then when it comes to more the screening side, for the screening, as Gavin and we've all kind of already said, there's sort of testing at the end of every deload week. So every 3 to 4 weeks, there's a testing where we do isometric mid-thigh pulls, punch throws, counter movement jumps. And those that data obviously gets put in sort of a trend analysis as well, given the camp status they're in, seeing if the trends are lining up with where the athlete should be. Energy systems testing we usually do on more of like an individual needs basis. So VO2 max testing, mean glycolytic power, those kind of tests are more on an individual basis. But then again, there's trend analysis in all those data that we use, and that's all discussed in a team setting in our morning meetings, and to see if there's any non-technical training difference, or if we need to change something, that's then discussed between all of us.
And how is that information relayed back to the athlete? Are you using Power BI visualizations? Are you just educating them one-on-one or small group settings?
Yeah, good question. So we definitely use group education sessions. What you also have to be wary of, we're at with a Chinese population, so there's always a translation issue. So for example, looking at subjective wellness questionnaires, we're looking to implement those things as well, but there's a translation issue there, validation of these sort of forms. So when we relay information to the athletes, it's usually in like almost a one-on-one consultation where we sit down. We can easily pump out reports, and we do. So for example, if they do a VO2 max test or something like this, they definitely get a data summary sheet, which is relayed to them and translated as well. But when it comes to a more severe change in training plan due to some sort of flag that we've identified, we seek a conversation with the athlete, including all the departments who are going to make changes, and then relay that to the athlete in more of an individual consultation.
What about the uniqueness of Fight Camp and possibly some like Omega Wave and other monitoring devices, possibly telling an athlete something you don't necessarily want them to know going into a fight, where you want them to be, I guess, psychologically prepared and also confident? How do you take out any of these monitoring processes as you go into a fight, or are you keeping it stable?
Yeah, so on an individual basis as well. We do have some changes between off camp and fight camp. In the testing, we for example, we don't do isometric mid-thigh pulls in fight camp, just because we don't need that injury risk playing in. It's not something we need to worry about during fight camp. Very interesting about Omega Wave, also pretty individual. Some athletes, they don't mind seeing all the results daily. Some athletes, they just do the test and they trust us to look at the data, and if there is a flag, we approach them. If we don't approach them, then they're sort of all good. It's not sort of one system fits all, because some athletes actually want that data, whether it's showing that they're overly fatigued, which we kind of don't want. But yeah, we do it on an individual basis, but it does definitely change between off camp and fight camp.
Yeah, excellent. Dean, did you have anything to add in that perspective of communicating to athletes around preparing themselves for fights, because that's a unique component? And are you using some of this monitoring information to try and influence athletes as they go into a fight?
Influence them in what way?
Using it to positively reinforce possibly how they're feeling or how they're looking on the mat, from a technical and tactical component, with what they're reporting subjectively or objectively to Joe and the rest of his team.
Yeah, so I mean, in a general sense as well, from the technical part, we like I said, we do a technical assessment of their strengths and weaknesses from a technical standpoint, and off camp is generally, in a general sense, in terms of emphasis, is a weakness focus, so developing their weaknesses, and then in fight camp, it's more of a strength focus, so what their capacities are. So that there's a psychological component to that in that decision making, so that in fight camp they're working on the things that are positive, but there would be decision making on terms of the personality of the athlete, about what's being communicated with them in terms of, I would never lie to an athlete in terms of telling them they're good when they're not doing good, but there might be a lie through omission in terms of certain things being communicated. But you know, if there's a, you know, you've got to be on it. There's got to be that level of trust with the athlete, depending, you know, in terms of how you approach that, and with their with it being a fight sport, a combat sport. There's a huge psychological component to it in terms of confidence. So everything that we're doing in terms of our programming and the way we structure training is through a lens of does it build confidence in the athlete. So if there's, you know, positive reinforcement that's coming from some of that data, then of course that's going to be shared. But at the same time, if there needs to be an adjustment and we need to pull back, then that will be communicated, but there will be considerations for the proximity to the fight. And if it will say fight week or something, there's not necessarily load management decisions that will be made at that point. So then you'd be doing more harm than good in that scenario. So like Felix said, it'd be person specific and situation specific about that decision making process.
Joey, did you have anything to add to those points from Dean and Felix at all? I know you've done a lot in regards to with RPE and possibly some of the measurements around not just, you know, how hard a session was, but technically or cognitively how fatiguing it is. Have you seen anything within the MMA athletes that is more reliable, or you think is becoming more important for quantifying load?
Yeah, well, look, to be honest, we still use CR10, category ratio 10 scale, and we spent a heck of a lot of time in terms of educating the athlete using a thing called the blackness test, where there's different shades of black that helps them quantify what rating they're going to use. So we really did our homework on making sure what we've set up regarding ratings of perceived exertion is going to be accurate and valid and best practice as possible. And then, as Felix alluded to, and Dean, they both sit down and say, oh, well, this is what I rated the session. This athlete was up here. Normally he's in our mid zone. What's he doing up there? And then it's just another way of asking questions. I would add something on the mega wave too, and specifically around fight week. So normally the mega wave will get taken out during fight week, and that's a consideration that, and Reid and Dean can both allude to this in much more detail. That fight week is such a unique part of MMA where there's literally the whole concern is cutting weight. Or 90% of the concern is cutting weight and making sure you cut weight properly. So the amount of training you can do in that week and what you can actually do in that week is really limited from a physical standpoint. And it's such a unique aspect of the sport that it takes a while for you to kind of grasp what they can and can't do around that, around like working backwards from that fight week is where you need to start, right? You need to start with the endpoint in mind and then come backwards from there and then try and involve all the different technical disciplines. But that fight week is such a unique aspect that just getting your head around it is really interesting.
I'd be interested to hear your insights around that weight management component, Reid, and as Joe alluded to, how you're refining, I guess, the weight cutting component in conjunction with Dean and the weight classification component to maintain as much physical output without the negative aspects of cutting weight?
Yeah, I mean, we can really get into the weeds with it all. I don't know how deep you want to go with it, but exactly what you said, like the whole idea is to try and maintain performance and health as much as possible. So I guess, so two things. One is following like an evidence-based best practice approach to weight cutting, which I would say every one of our fighters have not been doing prior to when they arrive at our academy. You know, they're from a lot of kind of old school hard gyms around China, and their weight cutting practices are not in line with what we would say is best practice. So one, it's that, and then getting into the weeds a little bit. Like one strategy you can use, which a lot of people don't, is actually keeping calories quite high during that last week or two. You know, traditionally people are kind of thinking they need to be starving themselves and, you know, getting by on these really low, all of these really large energy deficits. But once you can kind of explain to the athletes or not even explain to them, just program their diets around the fact that, you know, the acute weight loss part of it, the weight cutting, when we're essentially just trying to remove water, glycogen and gut content, it's actually somewhat independent of calorie intake. So we can actually keep calories quite high through a lot of high fat foods and things like this to try and prevent you know, increased risk of injury and stuff like this. So one, it's following the best practice approach. And then two, it's setting appropriate weight management goals and targets throughout the year relative to fight. So we constantly reiterate to the athletes, hey, at this time, relative to your fight, you should be weighing around this, you know. And again, a lot of these athletes, the gyms they come from, they haven't given it much thought to the long-term weight management planning. They kind of just, you know, eat and train, and then, you know, 2 weeks before a fight start starving themselves and try and get the weight down. And so, you know, just having some clear targets goes a long way to helping them manage their weight better. And then in terms of refining it as well, it's obviously we're doing the majority of it because we're programming their diets and the recovery post weigh-in at the events. We always like to educate the athletes, and particularly after fights, we sit down and have a bit of a post-fight analysis of their weight cut. So Dean will sit down and talk to them about what they did good in the fight, what they did bad, what they need to improve on next time. But we'll do the same in the nutrition department, where we sit down and kind of feed them, you know, probing and leading questions to make them think more about how their weight cut went and just try and foster that insight into their weight making practices, which is really important because we want to set them up for success, you know, into the future and after they leave the academy. So that's one way that we do it.
We had a question from one of the people listening in around the banning of the IV hydration and if that's had a big impact on strategies employed for weight cutting.
Yeah, interesting question. Certainly, like a lot of fighters in the past have liked to use IVs because in one sense it's quote unquote easier because, you know, you don't have to eat and drink all the food and fluids. You can just kind of sit there and put an IV in your arm. But the thing with MMA is you've got 24 to 30 hours between when you step on the scales or step off the scales and when you fight. So it's actually a long period of time. And you can recover completely fine without the IV. And in fact, like, so as Dean mentioned, we've got a lot of fighters from these different gyms around China, and a lot of them come from some big name gyms and from the same gyms. And we've got a whole group of fighters that were used to using IVs prior to being part of our academy. And I think in the beginning, they were quite hesitant to not use the IV, but we're trying to set them up for success in the UFC. And of course, they're not allowed to use IV in UFC. So they're following our protocols in terms of recovery and rehydration. And all of them have said they felt better not doing the IV. Like it's a bit of a task because, again, they have to eat and drink the fluids that we prescribe, but they all report feeling better and their weight returns to a similar degree as it would with the IV. But they're not feeling bloated. They're feeling lighter. They're feeling just, you know, more like themselves. So I don't think it's an issue to not use the IV. However, for sure, a lot of fighters were used to using an IV, so maybe it's more of a psychological crutch that they need to get around.
Probably leave me.
Can I add something in there? One thing that coincided with that is that the UFC at one point, originally, the weigh-in was at 4 p.m. and then the fight, you know, anywhere from 4 o'clock again into the evening, and then with the time that the IV got very similar close time, the IV got banned, then the weigh-ins got turned to like 9 o'clock in the morning. So that also that added, you know, quite a few hours to support what, you know, Reed's saying there, that those two things coincide. So the additional time could potentially mitigate any perceived advantages of using an IV, but when you're over that, you know, period of time, 30 hours or whatever, then you should be able to do it with nutritional interventions rather than you know, using an IV.
Reed, what I was going to ask you about in regards to challenging, I guess, preconceived ideas or what some of the athletes had done previously, you alluded to with the IV, but also when it comes to weight management and weight cutting, if you've got athletes that have been previously used to just trying to drop weight as quickly as possible, how did you go about trying to educate and influence them around those long-term strategies? And was it about giving them a bandwidth at certain times in their fight camp? And if you could give us an example of maybe a weight classification of how you had used that.
Yeah, in terms of educating them around it, it's quite difficult actually. So for a variety of reasons. Number one, kind of sports nutrition knowledge in China is a long way behind even some other Asian countries and definitely Western countries. And then even the recognition that nutrition is important for your performance, you know, isn't there to the same degree that it is in, you know, Australia or the US or Europe. And another factor that makes it very difficult is that I don't speak Chinese, so that's quite difficult. So all of the kind of face-to-face explanations have to happen through one of our staff, Taylor, who's a nutrition coordinator. She's actually a registered dietitian, did her education in the US, but when she's a Chinese national. But when she started, she had you know, next to no MMA nutrition specific knowledge. So I've had to do a lot of work kind of upskilling her, but she's really fantastic now and, you know, has a good grasp on MMA nutrition. So we kind of figured that issue out. But then in terms of how do we actually educate them around their weight management, like I said before, giving them those targets. And it's not that you always have to be able to make weight you know, on 2 weeks notice and you need to keep your weight low, but it's just setting realistic expectations around, hey, you're going to have a fight. You're probably going to, you know, put on some weight after a fight, because this is what always happens is people, you know, spend 6 or 8 weeks dieting and then they kind of blow out a little bit. But putting realistic expectations around how much you can blow out and then the rate that we want to see the weight coming off as you lead into the next fight. And a big part of our education, other than kind of, you know, we have like signage around the facility to do with nutrition, and we also do like group presentations to the group. But a big part is just the kind of day-to-day, you know, 5-minute, 1-minute conversations, you know, little tidbits of information that we feed the athletes, and then strategically teaching them things at key times. So we might give the group presentation about weight cutting, but if a fighter doesn't have a fight coming up, or even worse, they've just had a fight, they don't care about, you know, calories and carbohydrates and low salt and all this. Like, they're just thinking about the hot pot they're going to eat that night for dinner. But when they've got that fight coming up and they're about to make weight in 2 weeks, we use that opportunity again to get them in the room, put their numbers up on the screen, show them, hey, this is your weight now. This is how it should be trending over the next 2 weeks. These are the strategies that we're going to, you know, implement to make sure that you make weight. And it's just kind of constantly reiterating what we're doing and why we're doing it. And, you know, a lot of our athletes don't want to think too hard about it. They just want to be told what to eat, and we give them specific menus. And our cafeteria staff even help kind of police what they're doing in that final week or two. So on the one hand, the athlete could just not even think about it and just do what they're told, but we always try and, you know, explain and educate them along the way. And I think the better fighters and the ones that are setting themselves up for success are the ones that do, you know, learn and not just do. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but yeah, that's kind of how we approach it.
No, you're definitely great insight. What about, we're obviously talking a lot about fight camp preparation, the mental skills component and the psychological cognitive preparation. Dean and Joe, do you guys use psychologists or mental skills training, mental toughness training as a component of fight camp preparation, or is that very much individualized based on if you feel that that's something the athlete needs?
I'll go for that then, Joe. Yeah. So as part in Vegas, we have partnered up with a sports psychology team that are as an additional service to all the UFC roster. But as part of the academy, we don't have a full-time member of staff, but it's something that's important in terms of the way that I program and in terms of goal setting. There's like I said about the confidence, like if you use sparring as an example, during fight camp, there are factors that play into the for example, like at first it's fresh partners, and the opponent can be either the same or better than them in terms of their technical ability, or where that sort of determined pecking order of the academy is. And as you progress through the fight camp, we also have a fight day replication where they have their hands wrapped, or they're in the octagon. People are watching, and it's recreating as much as possible. Fight conditions. I'll be in there refereeing as well, so there's someone, an additional third man in the octagon. So those type of factors are subtle effects that we can have on the psychology of preparing for the fight and recreating real life situations and creating that familiarity that you want with the performance to reduce performance anxiety and so forth. And as the sparring, as I said, goes forward, then as they're getting fitter, and the opponent I might choose opponents that are more on their level or potentially below. So again, there's subtle confidence building things where they're seeing over the period of the fight camp that they're improving their sparring, they're doing better, and obviously they're going to be fitter as well. And they also have opponents that are tiring at the same time as them, so they're not having fresh opponents, so they're getting a more realistic feel of the pace of fighting as well. So those type of more sort of subtle factors. Something that I previously used that I found was really effective was visualization. So both post training and for skill acquisition in terms of going over the drills, but then also visualizing the fight and the feel of the walk to the cage, the feel of the lights, and visualizing those types of things with the language barrier, and that hasn't been something that we've been implementing, and because the tone and stuff that you need to be using and the choice of words when you're doing those visualizations are so important that if that's through a translator, things can be lost, and there's potential for not more damage, but not being as effective as we would hope. But that would be something that I would normally implement as part of the psychological aspects that we don't in Shanghai.
I'd also just jump on there around that language like barrier and the sort of what you can do coaching, and some other things that Dean and the whole team do really well is that, say in off camp there might be a greater bandwidth for, say, negative feedback. But as you get closer into fight camp, that bandwidth changes to more positive feedback. So they're getting more reinforcement positively, and they're feeling better about themselves. That they've got this thing in their head going, my coach actually thinks I've really improved. And then there's also a periodization of feedback that we try and give across the whole team, in terms of one week there might be a lot of feedback given to the athletes, another week there might be less, and that revolves through as another way of developing ownership for the athletes. And that's something that we've tried to do across both the technical and non-technical disciplines.
Yeah, fantastic. Paul, how does that fit with you in regards to athletes who are possibly just have pain during a fight camp? Or it may not be an injury per se, but let's say an athlete is restricted by discomfort and or pain. How are you trying to influence that so that they can maintain training and a high level of performance, but then also decreasing the risk of further injury?
Yeah, so that's one of the key things that our objective as physiotherapists there is to do, is kind of optimize their performance and maximize their time training. So by the nature of the sport, it's expected that they are going to be coming in with aches and pains, and some kind of progress towards more injury, etc. But kind of the way that we try and handle that is by kind of every morning before training, we run like a triage clinic. So an opportunity for the fighters to either identify from the day before, so they can either identify the day before itself, or if they wake up that morning with something that's grumbling and something isn't quite right, then come in, get a check on it, and kind of we can then determine whether they are okay to continue with training as would be the routine, or whether we need to kind of modify their training or withdraw them from it completely. And that's a discussion that we have as a team every morning. So kind of 7:30 through till about 8:30, 8:40 in the morning. That's our triage window. And then around 8:30, 8:40, we have a team meeting and we discuss those cases there. So as Dean's kind of conveniently, thank you, put up the schedule for us there. You can see the purple blocks at the top of that schedule. On the screen are our triage windows there. And then we have our meeting at 8:40, which is how we kind of coordinate as a team what it is that we need to do with those athletes. So I hope that answers that for you.
Yeah, and are you seeing a higher prevalence of different types of injuries depending on the type of athlete, whether a striker or a grappler, or just even a different type of athlete with MMA versus what you've worked with previously, and the types of injuries you're typically seeing?
I mean, as I say, I came from rugby, so I've seen pretty much most injuries, and I pretty much see similar patterns here. But yeah, I think to some degree we do see some patterns of kind of more neck and low back issues with kind of more the grapplers, and more kind of shoulder peripheral injuries towards the strikers.
And are you implementing any form of global intervention to reduce risk of injury? So AFL or field-based sports will tend to use the FIFA 11 plus and certain strategies. Is there anything that you have tried to formulate from an MMA perspective that you've seen value in?
So, I mean, that's definitely a big work in progress for us as the UFC PI as a whole, both across Shanghai and Vegas. Ultimately, the way we look at it right now is that we use their entry information from the combine. So when we do that kind of baseline orthopedic screening, where we're determining if they have certain range of motion deficits or certain kind of strength deficits there. And we're looking at the S&C testing that they do to see if there's any deficits within that, and also for any feedback from the MMA coaches, whether they are identifying any limitations. And if we have to do a specific assessment on that, then let's say it's they can't kick quite high enough, then we're looking towards their hips and low back and legs to see if there's any deficit there. And then we take that information and we try and kind of combine it with the S&C programming. So Gavin kind of is a wizard of that type of thing, to modify the S&C programming that he's doing to kind of either, or to essentially to optimize the capabilities that the athlete has within that, and either provide remedial work as part of the warm-ups, and then kind of as an extra to that, because we found when we started off, we were just kind of using the warm-ups to provide that remedial work. We were finding that it still wasn't quite hitting the mark with some of the athletes. So we've introduced something as well alongside that triage window in the morning, which we're kind of calling Prep the Day. And it's essentially a window of opportunity for them to kind of do some activations, do some mobilizations in the morning, just to kind of prepare them and optimize their physical incompetency, so we say, to kind of minimize those risks for injury through training.
And from a technical lead perspective, as Joe spoke about before, are you driving that, or yourself and Gav in collaboration, just review and then determine what each athlete is doing?
Yeah, it's kind of an evolving process. So ultimately we're looking at those and we're determining it. Gavin might get eyes on that before I do, generally, with potentially some of the training, depending on kind of how busy we are. But it is always a process where every week we kind of meeting up with between ourselves, and then kind of feeding back to the rest of the team in terms of where we feel athletes are progressing, whether we feel we need to kind of continue modifying their load, or whether we can start reintroducing them back into training. And ultimately, kind of over a block of a 6-week period, so to speak, we'll kind of just keep tabs on them and see where they are. But as I say, that's really an ongoing weekly process where we will kind of monitor where they are and communicate that on a daily basis with the team.
Yeah. Gav, are you seeing common trends within any of the athletes around modifications of the program on the gym floor, after a sparring or grappling session, submission sessions that are then forcing you to have to adapt what is ideal, or are the athletes pretty resilient from that perspective?
I think our athletes are extremely resilient given what they go through and the amount of loading and impact they have to. It's a tough sport, right? But the general two that we'll find tend to be backs and neck, like Paul was saying. And so that's just a literal conversation with the athlete on that day, or if it seems to be an ongoing issue, then Paul and I definitely communicate every day. So it's adjusting those small changes, whether it's we take loading off because it's a back issue, or we take out that accessory neck work that is supposed to be in the program and alter it to another one of their potential weaknesses or issues. So maybe they've got ankle mobility drills that we can actually put in there instead of the neck. We'll still look to individualize their issues so that we're still actually progressing them as an athlete. We don't want to just give them something random. It still needs to be appropriate for them as an athlete. And that's where those conversations with Paul are really essential. And obviously once we do that, then we forward that to Dean, like Paul was saying, and Dean probably gives us even more information as well from what he's seen on the top floor, because we can't always get up there and see training. So yeah, that's where the communication is really essential for us. And it certainly helps me in my programming, even on that day, changing it. Paul might come out of the PT room having been dealing with someone and just say, you just need to watch this person's right leg. We can't do something. Have you got jumping, or is it strength work today? And then we'll just need to make those necessary adjustments. And it might only be a day. You know, it might just be from that specific session, really acute. And then the next day, Paul and Alice, his coordinator for physiotherapy, will go to work on it, and it's fine by the next day. So I guess it depends on the chronic and acute stage and where they're up to in their fight camp preparation as well.
Yeah, definitely. They'll do no harm approach. And obviously with some small windows, as you spoke about with 3-week blocks, if you miss a couple of strength sessions within that, you miss an important period of time to develop the athlete. Paul, I don't know if you can touch on, we've had a question around concussion and the policies. It's quite a hot topic within, I guess, American football and even Australian rules football. From a UFC perspective, do you have a protocol that you guys follow? And could you give us an insight into that and the management of it?
Yeah, sure. So kind of this again is an evolving process for us within kind of UFC PI, and something that is, I guess, in the world of sports medicine is an evolving topic. But currently we're using the guidelines from the Association of Ringside Physicians. They released a consensus statement back in about 2018 in terms of return to play from concussive events. And it's very similar to what you'll see in kind of NRL, kind of rugby league, rugby union, AFL, of graduated return to sport. So we do our baseline testing. So we use C3 Logics as part of our assessment tool. We collect that information as a baseline. And then if we have a suspected event, concussive event, we'll reassess them on that. And we'll also get our sports physician to kind of check them over as well at the earliest convenience for that to happen. And then we just monitor the symptoms and take them through those progressive stages, like aerobic activity, then kind of developing into a bit more sport specific work, then adding some resistance training, and then progressing that towards more context work towards kind of several days, several weeks down the line. Contact within combat sport is inevitable, and it's just kind of graduating that back. So we won't let someone go into a sparring session straight away. We'll start off with getting to do some bag work, and then kind of either get into try some jiu-jitsu, and then kind of building up through that.
Yeah, excellent. It's an ever-evolving topic. Dean, we had a question around the use of sparring in preparation of MMA athletes. Is it still forming a large proportion of athlete preparation? And you spoke about some of the variety between off camp and training camp? Does sparring make up a larger portion the closer you get to the fight, or has that changed over your time in the UFC?
Yeah, no, definitely. You know, compared to when you know, myself and the, you know, Team Roughhouse boys, we basically used to we didn't even really have a coach. We just turn up and fight each other, and we got better through being really fortunate of having, you know, 6 guys in the UFC in one gym, which was, you know, pretty unheard of in the UK. And we would just spar pretty hard all the time and create some different scenarios of sparring, but that was basically it. And there was no levels of sparring. We kind of pretty much went hard all the time, and there was no periodization of what that might look like. And whereas we've tried to do is, within the academy is, you know, be considerate for the fact that, you know, you can shorten people's careers with having the toughest fights, you know, in the gym. And, you know, people would joke when you're at the gym saying, oh, that round was for Sherdog, which is the, you know, record keeping website for MMA, because it was that, you know, that close to a fight in sparring. And I personally don't believe that you need too many of those in your training, particularly later on in your career. You know, the better you are as a fighter, some of the things around sparring is the ability to take a punch, the composure that you need for that, and that's important early in your career. And the emphasis towards sparring earlier in your career is probably greater than as you develop in your higher level, where you don't need that hard sparring. That stuff's been tested. You know that it's more just about timing and finding a range and working with different and implementing different game plans depending on the particular opponent. So in off camp, general prep, there still be kickboxing, boxing, so separated in that way, and then in fight camp it's only MMA sparring and then some situational sparring. So if you see on this timetable, sparring is only twice a week, and you see the guys that are in early fight camp are still sparring. This particular snapshot of a week, the guys in late fight camp, I can see that they must be in they're starting their taper there, so they're this is the week before fight week, so they're only doing a half sparring round, a half sparring session, which would mean on the Tuesday, which would mean they were doing only like 3 rounds of sparring, and then on the Thursday they're only doing technical sparring, so it's just like touch sparring. So we also have levels of sparring of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we try to brief the guys on what level of sparring they're having in relation to where they are in their camp. And that takes, you know, understanding, and that takes, sometimes you have to manage it and be like, no, bring that down and be on top of that. But, you know, I'd say there's been a shift from the time when, you know, I used to spar maybe 4 times a week to now where we do 2 times a week sparring. The intensity of that sparring is managed, and then the live rounds or situational sparring is just, you know, small snapshots, 30-second burst or 1-minute burst of a particular scenario, and controlling those parameters of what a particular skill set you might want to be working on.
It's fantastic insight, and really intriguing to see the different levels and the intricacy of detail that goes into every component of the UFC PI. I'm sure everyone who's tuned in has been fascinated with it as well. I'm keen to just finish today with getting a little bit of insight from each of you as to one thing that, coming from another sport into the UFC PI, that you brought from a sport that you felt was valuable for the UFC PI, but also if you were to step out of the UFC PI into another realm, what would you have taken from your experience that you think would influence that environment? And Felix, I'm going to start with you because you were in Shanghai in basketball and some other sports. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts here, mate.
Yeah, very, very good question. So when I was with the basketball team, the Shanghai Sharks here in Shanghai, it was almost like a one-man band. You know, I was doing the strength and conditioning, I was doing the sports science, and the focus kind of shift from preseason to in-season. And obviously basketball is a team sport versus MMA is sort of an individual sport. But what I was able to bring from basketball to the PI was we really do have a team within the, like, sort of the academy is almost the team. So managing that is quite similar to sort of basketball. And with the basketball guys, I was doing some jump monitoring, some readiness in that sense. and those things maybe don't translate as well to MMA. So I adapted there to kind of make sure that all the testing is MMA specific and really getting the most out of these MMA athletes. And the best thing about the PI here in Shanghai is sort of what Joseph talked about is our interdisciplinary approach. So coming from sort of a one-man band with the Sharks, coming to the PI with, you know, experts in each department and having those conversations and being able to monitor and manage the athlete at such a depth is hopefully something that we could take past the UFC as well. That approach of how to work together and all departments being on one level.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think if all high performance teams could strive for that, I think they'd be very successful. Reed, having had experience in a few different organisations, I'd be interested to hear your insights.
Yeah, kind of a difficult question actually. In terms of working with different sports, most of my work has been with combat sports and kind of competing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu myself and being around MMA a while, and then working with the teams leading up to Rio. You know, it's kind of all been combat centric, but I think just being around, you know, the AIS, which is a, you know, kind of world leading organization, and then with GSSI, with the professional sports in the US, just bring that level of, I guess, just, you know, professionalism and kind of the evidence-based approaches. You know, MMA and fighting sports are quite immature in terms of their adoption of sports science as a whole. So, you know, like a lot of the stuff is not real groundbreaking. You know, it's just like the foundation building blocks type things that you want to get right. You know, it's like the base of the pyramid type stuff. So I think, you know, like I would say across a lot of areas of performance and athlete development, it's just getting the basics right. And I think for myself, not just with the UFC PI, but my work with combat sports athletes in the past, it's like just being able to relate to the athletes and explain things to them in a way that kind of makes sense, and increasing the adoption of those evidence-based practices, I think is key. But I think we're on the right path, and I think you know, in 10, 20, 30 years, combat sports will be more in line with some of the team sports and endurance sports in terms of the adoption of evidence-based practices.
Good advice. Get the basics right. It's definitely held most organisations in good stead. Paul, anything change if you were to step back into rugby from what you've learnt from UFC PI and what you took from rugby into UFC?
I mean, I guess I really echo sort of what Reed was saying. You know, do the basics, do them well, and then you start building on things from there. I think potentially what I've brought into the PI from my past experience is kind of that is the need for kind of really clear, concise, and kind of transparent communication between the teams. So, you know, sometimes some of the harder conversations are the ones that need to be had, and kind of everybody presenting those within the frame that actually is for constructive criticism and the benefit of everybody else to do that. And certainly having had the experience working in Southeast Asia for a few years and kind of working across different ethnicities of athlete, which is very pertinent in Malaysia, and certainly kind of bringing that into the cultural side for China has been really important as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Gav, what about you, mate? Trying to generate a Chinese surfer and now coming into UFC PI and then stepping back out. What would you take from it?
Well, yeah, it's a good point, because with surfing, a lot of the work we need to do is on breath work. And so that's been a really cool component that we've been able to add into our program. And we've been able to do a variety of that on land, on water, and even with things like sled work, with, you know, working on CO2 tolerance and those sorts of things. I think that's an aspect with regards to recovery that has been a really nice addition to our program that I feel like I've brought in from the surfing background. I think also for me, something that I guess I'm putting in, because it's quite a new sport. Reed was talking about best practice. Well, we're still trying to develop all of those things. It's such a young sport from a sports science perspective that we're trying to discover the answers to these questions, which has been really a really cool thing that we've all been involved with. And for me personally, taking away, or if I was to step away from it, something that's really helped me a lot being in this situation is having to individualize for people, which is we're in a team environment within the academy. It's like training a squad, but every single one of them, it's an individual sport. So I have to be really cognizant of that and work out how I'm going to best approach a team environment for the individual. We've got weight class categories, we've got age differences, we've got different genders all training at the same time. We have injuries to consider. So for me, coming up with a system that makes that as easy as possible for me to program for, that's definitely something that is in current work that I'm trying to get better at, and also I feel like is going to set me up nicely.
Yeah, well, you've got a great team around you to continue to build out an adaptable system, mate. So excited to see what's next. Dean,
100%.
you've been in UFC for a long time. Any other sport interests you in jumping out and taking what you've learnt from UFC PI, or also transitioning from, say, the Vegas component to Shanghai? Was there anything that you've learnt that you feel would better prepare you if you were to step out into another PI institute?
I think one of the main, obviously, challenges has been the language barrier. And so, trying to create drills that are implicit in the sense that the outcome of the drill is what you're trying to get them to learn, rather than just explaining something and then having them to go away. It's made me sort of change the way my coaching approach in that sense, and being more creative with the drills that we use in terms of skill acquisition, because there is a language barrier. And I don't always know that the choice of my words are gonna, which I previously maybe think the cues that I'm using are quite important, but if they're going through a translator, it's still his interpretation of it, and then his choice of cues that he's using. So there's definitely been a challenge in that sense, and then changing to my approach to coaching in terms of the creation of drills. So that's something that I would take now, even if I was working with athletes that do speak English. I think it's a better way for skill acquisition in that process, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely. I remember talking to Joe previously, the language barrier, and just educating you and being a better coach. So I'm sure, no doubt, you're having great impact in the current environment. And as you move forward, Joe, you've gone from Chinese track and field athletes to UFC. Anything that you've learned that you think, if you were to step back out into a team sport or another individual sport, that you would take with you from the experience?
I could be flippant and say how to punch somebody in the head or how to take somebody down, something like that. But no, definitely like just a systems-based approach in terms of what actually influences performance. How then do you influence the athletes to obtain that performance, and taking steps back and then interweaving all the disciplines together in a somewhat cohesive fashion to get to those KPIs and get to whatever stage of the system you need to get to. So that's definitely something that's I've learned a lot and would be able to take and apply to other areas for sure.
Well, I'm really excited to see what UFC PI Shanghai does in the future. You've got a fantastic interdisciplinary and collaborative team here, and I really want to thank you all for your insights. Hopefully you're all back on the ground in China soon, and we can continue to see the growth of the UFC around the world. So thanks for your time today, everyone. Appreciate everyone who logged in, and stay safe, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Sal.
Thank you,
Thanks,
mate.
Sal. Thanks for having us on, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.